Welcome to the first Sustainable Future lecture this year, organized by the Open University, Europa, and the Eurasia Foundation. My name is Bertolt Kuhn, and I speak to you from Berlin, Freie Universität Berlin. The topic of my lecture is the relevance of the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development from the perspective of project managers and practitioners. The United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development gained strong traction, and it developed into a powerful reference framework and a global agenda for transformative change. This lecture highlights the relevance of the 2030 Agenda from the perspective of project managers and practitioners and sheds light on perceptions and sustainability actions of diverse stakeholders, including international cooperation agencies, the business community, and the financial industry. My lecture is divided into 6 parts. First, the sustainability paradigm and the added value of the 2030 Agenda and the 17 SDGs. Second, the stakeholder landscape. Third, international and development cooperation. Fourth, SDGs at city level, localizing the SDGs. Fifth, sustainable finance. And sixth, the SDGs and global megatrends. The sustainability paradigm and the added value of the United Nations 2030 Agenda and the 17 SDGs. A paradigm shift is an important change that happens when the usual way of thinking is replaced by a new and different ways, and new discourses are emerging. The term paradigm shift relates back to the work of the American physicist, historian, and philosopher of science, Thomas Samuel Kuhn. He wrote his famous book, The Structure of Scientific Revolution, in 1962. And it's one of the most influential books in academic and popular circles, and introduced the term paradigm shift, which has since become a kind of an English language idiom. Development, of course, is a comprehensive concept. A major reference framework is the Human Development Concept, the Human Development Report of the United Nations Development Program, which has developed a comprehensive set of indicators. The concept of development has evolved from a focus on the GDP or the GDP per capita to much more comprehensive understandings of modernization, human development, and development with respect to nature and planetary boundaries. It's towards the time of the millennium that a sustainable development concept has become an overarching reference framework for development. And development, one could say, is now seen through the lens of the sustainability paradigm. And sustainable development calls for transformative change. Let me spend a few minutes on the Human Development Index, which has been for many decades a major reference framework for analyzing development. The Human Development Index also ranks countries. And we see here that the key categories are long and healthy life, knowledge, and a decent standard of living. We also see the Global Multidimensional Poverty Index in these reports. When I did my PhD on participatory development in rural India, the term participatory development was emerging as a kind of a new paradigm. And strong notions of participatory development emerged in recognition of the shortcomings of top-down, externally imposed, and expert-oriented blueprint-like research and development practices. Now, to some extent, the participatory development paradigm has been replaced by the sustainable development paradigm. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development gained strong traction and developed into a powerful reference framework and a global agenda for transformative change. Why? One reason is that it merged the development cooperation agenda with the environmental action agenda at the Rio Earth Summit conferences of the United Nations on Environment and Development. Then it gained further traction in the context of UN policies to deepen and broaden cooperation with diverse stakeholders, including the business communities, the financial sectors, but also social movements. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development is a truly one world agenda. It requires efforts and policies of adjustments of all countries, including industrialized countries. Previous development goals, such as the Millennium Development Goals, focused mainly on developing countries. They were supposed to catch up in development, but it became more and more evident that planet Earth would not have the capacity to allow for models of unsustainable growth with heavy greenhouse gas emissions that accelerated environment degradation and alter the climate through emissions. Here you see the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. They cover social, economic, and environmental aspects. As you can see, there are several goals pertaining to environmental protection and climate action. There was only one environmental goal under the Millennium Development Goals, so this is a significant change. So the global goals have become greener. Next to the 17 SDGs, there are also 169 targets, which have been agreed by almost all the states in 2015 in September, and subsequently the custodian agencies, those international organizations chiefly involved in the promotion and implementation of the agenda, they proposed indicators, more than 230 indicators related to the goals and the targets, and we'll get to this later. Which are the principles behind the 2030 agenda? One overarching principle is called "Leave no one behind." That has developed into a kind of a slogan. It means that the agenda applies to very poor and fragile states and also to disadvantaged people. The principle of universality means that each and every country is supposed to promote and implement the 2030 agenda, unlike for the Millennium Development Goals, which were focused on the developing countries. These goals apply to rich and poor countries alike. Of course, different priorities will be there. And all of these countries are supposed to go through structural adjustments, sometimes deep structural adjustment, for example, in the context of decarbonization of the economy. Another overarching principle is the principle of shared responsibility. Not only governments, but also the business community, the financial sector, civil society groups, citizens, consumers, researchers, all are supposed to contribute to the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Integrated approaches. There might be some trade-offs between these 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Definitely, we will get back to this aspect. But the idea of the United Nations is, of course, that the 2030 Agenda attaches great importance to ensuring that the social, economic, and ecological dimensions of sustainability go hand in hand and are not played against each other. A final overarching principle is accountability. All countries are supposed to report progress. They can participate in voluntary national reviews. And at the global level, there are also mechanisms in place of regular monitoring and reporting. And there is capacity building support available for those countries being not really able to follow the relatively heavy monitoring and reporting requirements. When the 2030 agenda was agreed, there was criticism, sometimes even heavy criticism. The Economist titled the 169 commandments. The proposed sustainable development goals would be worse than useless. However, the picture has changed. Even the business community, consulting firms, the financial sectors have embraced the community, have embraced the sustainable development goals, and the 2030 agenda has developed into a powerful reference framework for diverse stakeholders, not only governments and international organizations, but also financial sector, business community, NGOs, researchers of different academic disciplines, and so on. How did the 2030 agenda came into being? An important element in the process was that the two work streams, the environmental work stream and the development cooperation work stream, were merged at the Rio+20 conference in Brazil. And this merger resulted in a political outcome documents which contained clear and practical measures for sustainable development. And 3 years before the goals were finally agreed upon, this Rio+20 conference really prepared the ground. Let's have a brief look at the Millennium Development Goals. They were less sophisticated, and there was only one goal focusing on environment. Goal number 8, that would correspond with SDG 17, that goal on partnership that has already been there. But many other goals on climate action, more specific goals, life underwater, life on land, they were not reflected specifically. Let's come to the targets and indicators. You will find beautiful icons, not only for the 17 development goals, but also for the 169 targets. Here you see 2 targets under the first goal: eradicate extreme poverty and reduce poverty by at least 50%. There are multi-dimensional poverty index projects. We'll get to this later, where extreme poverty and poverty is defined. The indicators are meant to be used for measuring the progress of the implementation of the SDGs. And what we have seen over the past years, that more and more international cooperation projects are referring to the SDGs and the targets, and even specifically to some of the indicators in their project planning documents. Are these SDG indicators always state of the art of indicator development? That's a different question. Indicators should normally be SMART, meaning specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. Some of these indicators are relevant to the impact level of projects, some more to the outcome level, and some more to the output level. Let me give you another example of how the indicators are related to the targets. SDG 11 is an innovative SDG because it's cutting across sectors. It's focused on cities and communities, and the indicators the targets include safe and affordable housing, for example, affordable and sustainable transport systems, inclusive and sustainable urbanization, protect the world's cultural and natural heritages. So you see quite diverse targets and indicators. I will also talk about the SDG number 12 on sustainable consumption and production. It's perhaps the most innovative goal because it addresses consumers, everybody of us. So we must admit if we go through the targets, then there is a slight bias towards production rather than consumption. What is sustainable consumption and production? You can read the definition of this slide. It's a definition provided by UNEP. And let me give you the example of this SDG to have a closer look at the targets and the indicators. There are quite many indicators, so a lot of work has gone into this SDGs. I will not read it out, but you can look at the PPT and enlarge it later. The custodian agency, the main custodian agency here for the target 12.1, which refers to implement the 10-year sustainable consumption and production framework, is the United Nations Environmental Program. And it is a very innovative SDG in a way, but we can say that it has a slight production bias, and it has a focus on technological progress. And there might be some conflicts with other SDGs and not enough attention paid to transboundary environmental harm. But we cannot go into the details. The global indicator framework includes, by the way, 231 unique indicators. Please note that the total number of indicators listed in the global indicator framework of SDG indicators is 247. So 12 indicators repeat under 2 or 3 different targets. I listed them below. Let us have a closer look at some of these indicators. I will not go through all of them. I choose one indicator per SDG. Of course, the indicators vary, but you can see that many of these indicators refer to the proportion of the population, proportion of agricultural area. So that can be measured. It's a quantitative criteria measured by percentage of population, percentage of area, or percentage of completion rate of education. But there are also some other indicators, and some of them, of course, subject to interpretation. What is efficient water use, for example, even access to electricity. What does it mean? Does it mean round-the-clock access to electricity at the household level? So there could be discussions about this one. SDG 8 includes a reference indicator to annual growth rate of real GDP that could be in conflict with the more environmental protection oriented SDGs. SDG number 9, target 9.1 includes a reference to passenger and freight volumes. And this could also be in conflict with reducing emissions. And an indicator such as redistributive impact of fiscal policy, of course, is difficult to measure, more difficult perhaps than others. In some cases, index projects like food loss index or food waste index provide the framework for indicator measuring. And yeah, this list should just give you an idea about the the character of these indicators, which have been developed by international organizations, sometimes with contributions of bilateral cooperation agencies and specialized institutions. There are regular progress reports on the SDGs. The annual Sustainable Development Goals report provides an overview of the implementation efforts to that date, and it highlights progress and areas where more action needs to be taken. We have seen the 2020 report, and that report noted that progress had been made in improving maternal and child health, in expanding access to electricity, and also increasing women's representation in government. Yet there were also areas where no progress could be made, like growing food insecurity, deterioration of the natural environment, and persistent and pervasive inequalities. These are the deficits the highlighted in the 2020 report. Here you find some more key findings of the SDG report 2020. I will not read out these findings, but please go through these findings. There are voluntary national reviews, and many countries participated in these reviews, developed and developing countries, some even twice, like Gambia 2020, 2022. These are not mandatory, but it is strongly recommended that these countries participate in these voluntary reviews, and these reviews are done by teams of experts, teams of international experts. So through this assessment exercise among peers, there could be a good exchange of information and good practices, and experts from one country look at SDG implementation in another country and may provide some good lessons learned from other contexts, their country. So this is an important and valuable process. The stakeholder landscape. Today, the 2030 Agenda is not only referenced by international organizations and national governments, but also by non-profits, the private sector, the financial industry, city-level initiatives, and also researchers. The key institution to promote and to implement the 2030 Agenda is, of course, the United Nations. And within the United Nations, there are specialized agencies. And for this particular purpose of implementing the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the high-level political forum has been established. We see the complex picture of United Nations organizations, which includes funds and programs. UNDP, UNEP, World Food Programme, UNICEF, UN Habitat are UN funds or programs, and there are related organizations, UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework for Climate Change, would be such a related organizations. And there are also specialized agencies such as ILO, FAO, and IFAD, UNESCO, and many of them play a role in promoting and implementing the agenda. The UN High-Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development was mandated already in 2012 by the outcome document of the Rio Plus 20 conference to steer the process of implementation of the SDGs. And the forum meets annually under the auspices of the Economic and Social Council for 8 days. And the 2022 theme will be Building Back Better from the Coronavirus Disease, while advancing the full implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable development. And please check out more information on the work of the high-level political forum of the United Nations, which is mandated to steer, to monitor the process of SDG implementation. There are custodian agencies of the SDGs. The so-called custodian agencies are those international organizations, these international cooperation agencies, which are deeply involved in promoting the agenda. They contributed to designing the indicators, monitoring and reporting progress. Let's take again the example of SDG 12. So there was the creation of an SDG 12 hub, and through collaboration within the hub, these custodian agencies aim to make SDG 12 and sustainable consumption and production accessible and transparent to government and others. I said it's an innovative goal, so it perhaps requires some more awareness raising and information sharing of good practices and how progress could be measured. Data collection, of course, is key to analyze the progress, and the UN Statistical Commission, they request the custodian agencies to provide a list of national institutions to provide data and when they provide these data. So you can see it's a very data-driven process and might be challenging for some countries with limited capacities, especially fragile states, to follow up with monitoring and reporting. And many development cooperation projects are meant to support authorities, ministries, agencies in poorer countries to fulfill their obligations, to advise them on implementation of one or the other SDG and target, and also help them to fulfill their monitoring and reporting obligations. Let us get an idea who are the custodian agencies, who are the custodians, and you will even find names of persons, not only agencies, in the internet. So for the SDG indicator 1.1.1, proportion of the population living below the international poverty line by sex, age, employment status, and geographic location. You have ILO doing the job of monitoring and reporting, and there's also a person mentioned who is responsible for that. For the indicator 1.1.1 with regard to employment status and geographical location, let us have a closer look at those organizations involved in designing and promoting the SDGs. We call them the custodians of the Sustainable Development Goals. And those agencies are deeply involved in designing indicators, monitoring and reporting on progress. Let's take the example of the SDG 12 on responsible consumption or sustainable consumption and production. And those agencies and organizations promoting this innovative SDGs, they have formed the SDG 12 hub, and their objective is to make the SDG on sustainable consumption and production accessible and transparent to government agencies and to others in terms of measuring progress on the SDGs, nationally tracking progress and accessing solutions to actually deliver on the agenda. And data collection, of course, is key to support the implementation process. So the United Nations Statistical Commission requested the custodian agencies to provide a list of national entities which in turn provide data to the international system and to share the data collection calendars. Depending on the SDGs, different organizations take the lead, play the role of the custodian agencies, for example, the International Labour Organizations and the World Bank for SDG 1, or International Union for the Conservation of Nature, or United Nations Environmental Program. Let's come to the section on international and development cooperation. International cooperation is far more advanced. It is deeper and broader than most people imagine, or media coverage on some critical political and economic issues on tensions between powerful countries may suggest. And the international organizations, including those playing the role of custodian agencies, play a key role in promoting those exchanges. They shape debates on future trends in a significant way. We witness a growing interdependence of the world's economies and culture and populations, driven by cross-border trade, technology, flows of investment, people and information, even though the COVID-19 crisis has probably temporarily reduced exchanges and also sparked some discourses of decoupling from certain economies and countries. Governance of international affairs is, of course, far insufficient if you think about the magnitude of global challenges that humanity needs to tackle together. Climate change, sustainable development are among these key challenges. Political cooperation is lagging behind the dynamics of economic and social exchanges, and the Sustainable Development Goals are meant to sustain global public policies and global governance for the sustainability transition. One of the key actors promoting the SDGs is the World Bank. I will not go into the details of these slides, but the World Bank, like the OECD and other UN organizations, have extensive reference to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development on their website. The World Bank is acting as one of the custodian agencies, for example. The OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, it is the club of the rich nations, even though that has changed with the economic progress of China. OECD has a very long history of engagement with United Nations organizations and considers itself as an organization providing policy advice. It's deeply engaged in peer review process between OECD member states, and they do a lot of work on the 2030 Agenda and the SDGs too. The Sustainable Development Goals are very powerful reference goals for international and development cooperation, in particular poverty reduction strategies. And we have different kinds of approaches, cooperation models, budget support, sector program support with pooled funding, specific program and projects. And most of these cooperation forms, they play explicit reference to the Sustainable Development Goals, to one or several goals. Let's have a look at Germany. So you see how SDG implementation is steered, is organized in Germany. It is chiefly steered by the State Secretaries Committee on Sustainable Development at the Federal Chancellery. But the different Länder, the provinces, and different kinds of ministries are involved in the process. I have provided, or here you can see a list of fields of actions like mobility, living and household, nutrition and food, and which German ministries are in charge of it. You can imagine that coordination is not an easy task. Germany has gone for voluntary reviews of the SDG process, and the report has been produced with support of international experts, includes some recommendation, and is available on the internet. The German Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development is probably the ministry most deeply involved in the promotion of the SDGs, and it operates SDG dashboards for its partner countries and also other cooperation countries, so that they have a good overview how SDGs are progressing in different countries. They've done it for countries in different continents. And of course, sometimes in failed state or in states with significant political problems, it's very challenging to do this. And I would like to draw your attention to the fact that collecting statistics, identifying key players to promote the SDGs is not easy in all countries, and especially in those countries which would badly need progress on SDGs. The German International and Development Cooperation Agency, the GIZ, runs a few specific programs on promoting the SDGs. And for the GIZ, the 2030 Agenda is the overarching framework that guides its work, which it implements in close cooperation with its partners and commissioning parties. And that is also the case for some other bilateral development agencies like Swedish CEDA or Canadian CEDA and so on. Here we have an example of Finnish development cooperation, and just to give you an idea how development cooperation, international cooperation projects function. Usually the major projects are based now on theories of change, and those theories of change very often specifically relate to one or several SDGs or targets. The typical evaluation criteria for international cooperation, development cooperation projects proposed and by the OECD Development Assistance Committee and widely used all over the world by World Bank, international organizations, bilateral development cooperation agencies are relevance, coherence, effectiveness, efficiency, impact, and sustainability. And you can imagine that especially at the relevance level, there's a lot of reference paid to global policy documents, such as the 2030 Agenda and the 17 SDG. But also when it comes to impact, those projects are supposed to specifically contribute to SDG targets, SDG goals, and also the indicators are referenced in many project documents. Let's have a look at the Finnish development cooperation once again. And you see, I mean, you can probably not read it very easily, but you can access the document and you can see how often specific SDG targets and goals are referenced in a typical sector strategy framework of international and development cooperation agencies. Coming back to the challenge to promote the SDGs in fragile states, you can see that there are some tools like the Multidimensional Poverty Index project of the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, which tries to collect adequate data for all countries. And of course, there is the Gini index, an important reference concept for measuring inequality. And inequality, as you know, is one of the key issues to be addressed by the SDGs. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the 17 SDGs, are very much a global agenda, but not only. They have trickled down to different levels, provincial levels, city levels, community levels, and there's pressure on national governments, on stakeholders, on the United Nations to further develop and promote the implementation of the agenda. We have a couple of amazing reports on localizing the SDGs with good practice examples, lessons learned, and recommendations. What does it mean, localizing the SDGs? Localizing is the process of taking into account the subnational contexts in the achievement of the agenda, from the setting of goals and targets to determining the means of implementation and using indicators to measure and monitor the progress. And we have the SDG 11, which explicitly addresses SDG implementation at the level of cities and communities, human settlements. And it's the linchpin of the localizing process. But all of the SDGs have targets directly related to the responsibilities of local and regional governments, particularly to their role in delivering basic services, health, education, environmental and climate protection, of course. There are a couple of campaigns at the level of cities. For example, the Global Goals Municipal Campaign in the Netherlands. About half of the municipalities in the Netherlands participate in this campaign, and you can find lots of information on it in the internet. And also the International Cooperation Agency of the Association of Netherlands Municipalities, VNG International, has drawn up a menu of inspiration, which provides ideas to municipalities around the world on actions they can take for each of the SDGs. There's a working paper of ODI on SDG implementation in Mumbai, taking the example of Mumbai. And of course, housing, health, education services are big issues in Mumbai. And we can really dive deep into city practices, good practices to learn more about SDG implementation. Lots of good reports are available. Which are the key stakeholders at the subnational level? We have the United Cities and Local Government Networks. This is a network of cities at local, regional, and metropolitan government level, and it's representing, it's defending, it's amplifying the voices of local and regional governments to leave no one behind and also no place behind. Remember, leave no one behind, one of the key slogans, the key principles of SDG implementation. UCLG is the umbrella organizations, but there are also other organizations at the city level promoting the SDG implementation. For example, we have also C40. I will get back to the role of C40, the Innovative City Network, later. First, let's see a report of the United Cities and Local Governments. And local governments are policymakers. They are catalysts of change. And the level of government best placed to think the global goals with local communities. As I said just now, C40 is an important actor because it has a precise focus on climate action. It started off with 40 cities, but now regroups nearly 100 world leading cities, and they collaborate together to delivering the urgent action needed for SDG implementation. And they have to earn their membership through action, and it's a performance-based memberships with relatively high leadership standards, and the mayors of the C40 cities are at the forefront of climate leadership, for example. you can see that C40 cities are not only spread over Europe or North America, but there are also many mega cities and big cities in global south. Sustainable finance. I choose to highlight sustainable finance because the United Nations have made sustained efforts to bring the financial industry on board of the SDG implementation, and the trend of green and sustainable finance has really gained strong traction in the past decade. We can see that in Germany, there's a new report. It's called Shifting the Trillions, Make the Financial Sector Work for the Implementation of the Goals and for Climate Action. The term sustainable finance primarily refers to the integration of environmental, social, and governance criteria, ESG criteria, in the decisions of investors. And the environmental criteria consider how a company performs as a steward of nature and how it contributes to addressing climate change, for example, or preserving biodiversity. Social criteria examine how a company manages its relationships with employees, with suppliers, with customers, and the communities in which it operates. And governance issues deal with companies' leadership, executive pay, audits, internal controls, and also shareholder rights. At the level of the European Union, we have the EU Sustainable Action Plan, and very recently we have the EU Sustainable Finance Taxonomy, which is a classification system for green investment in the first place, for climate change related investment, but it is also supposed to cover social and other issues. And the EU Sustainable Finance Taxonomy, of course, there are some issues already subject to debate and discussion. For example, the integration of nuclear energy or natural gas into the taxonomy. Germany and Austria and also Luxembourg strongly oppose that, while France, which is highly dependent on nuclear energy, is in favor of including nuclear energy into the sustainable finance taxonomy, and the issue is not yet resolved. One of the key stakeholders of promoting responsible investment and sustainable finance is the Principle of Responsible Investment, PRI. That's a UN-supported organization, and this organization works very closely with the European Commission and key stakeholders, and it considers the EU taxonomy offering lots of benefits to investors, identify investment opportunities which meet high standard of sustainability, construct taxonomy-aligned portfolios for investors, and strengthen and enable more focused dialogue between the investors and companies on investment impacts, and also support communication between fund managers and asset owners. The market share of sustainability funds has significantly increased. Here we see data of the Forum für nachhaltige Geldanlage, Sustainable Forum of Sustainable Investment in Germany, and we see really an uptick of sustainable investment in the past years. There is more and more coverage of academic publications on issues such as green finance and sustainable finance. You can see here on this graph, it was almost non-existent until about 1995, and then we see a significant growth from 2010, 2012 onwards. And Asia, of course, is a critical battleground for the ESG principles and SDG priorities. And we have seen a few taxonomy projects in China and also India to start linking investment opportunities to specific SDGs. UNDP has promoted such initiatives, and the goal of UNDP is to put the SDGs at the heart of the financial systems, with an emphasis on achieving this at the country level. There's a SDG taxonomy supported by UNDP China. I will not go into the details, but give you the reference of a work of Christoph Nedopil, Wang, and Matthias Lund Larsen and Mr. Wang. And I think it's available with the Journal of Sustainable Finance and Investment. Sustainable finance, what does it mean? Sustainable finance is a more comprehensive term than, say, responsible investment, a term which investors usually prefer, or ethical investment. This is a concept promoted mainly by nonprofits, by churches. By the way, the churches and some foundations are long-time promoter of ethical investment in Germany and have contributed to dialogue and action at the level of the German government and also the EU. And sustainable finance approaches, they started with so-called exclusion criteria related to various concerns of non-sustainable business investment practices, such as production or trade in controversial weapons, production of trade in tobacco, violation of human rights, social and labor standards, animal welfare, and gambling. Let's come to the final section of the linkages between the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and megatrends, so-called megatrends. Together with Dimitrios Machelos, I'm going to publish a book on global perspectives on megatrend, and we try to understand how analysts and experts, researchers from different world regions see future developments. And of course, they look at future developments from the risk, but also from the opportunity perspective. And we wanted to go for a well-researched analysis of megatrends and developed a model to define megatrends. So for us, a megatrend means it is well covered, very well covered by researchers. It is very high on global political agendas, and there's interest by global investors. A lot of media coverage and social movements relate to this particular trend. And you can see it also closely relates to the SDGs, though the megatrend concept is slightly more business oriented. These are our 12 megatrends, and if you have a closer look at it, you will find many of the SDG goals or targets in the megatrend concept too. For example, green economy or migration. Migration is not that prominent in the SDG framework, but it's clearly covered under the SDG 10, reduced inequality, and inequality is a megatrend as such, of course. Yeah. Climate action and sustainability, for us, this trend will deepen and broaden over the next decade. Awareness of climate change will continue to grow, and it will spread quickly in almost all countries and regions. Emission trading will expand, and it will become a major incentive for companies to cut their emission, put pressure on technological change and transitions. And there will be pressure on political leaders to reach far-reaching global agreements, but that will be very difficult. Negotiations between the states at climate summits will remain difficult because of diversity of structural challenges in countries and regions, and also because of issues related to claims for expected financial compensations for losses attributed to climate change. Let's have a look at the Climate Change Performance Index. That was designed by the German non-profit organization German Watch, and together with also the new Climate Institute, and it compares climate action across different countries, and it's a great and independent monitoring tool that aims to enhance transparency in international climate policies. And such tools, of course, support commitment, support monitoring of the implementation of the SDG. In this particular case, SDG 13 on climate action. Green economy, of course, is a major trend, and multinational companies will ride the trend, and political leaders will present green economies as a viable alternative to only growth-driven economic strategies. Of course, we also see fundamental opposition to green growth strategies. However, we believe, or I believe, that green economy discourses will continue to dominate the debates, especially in developing and emerging countries which cannot afford to go without growth, but growth will be greener, has to be more sustainable. Sustainable finance, it's not explicitly, very explicitly mentioned in the SDGs, but it's a very important trend, and the United Nations is very eager to bring the investment community on board, and they are supposed to make contributions to the achievement of the different SDGs. And how can this be done? And this is the purpose of some of the taxonomy projects supported by the United Nations. We've seen the example of China, the SDG taxonomy project, so that investors get some guidance how they can actually contribute to promote the implementation of SDGs, and which are the key stakeholders of the SDGs. We see, of course, the UN and the international cooperation agencies, national, provincial, local governments and cities, but also the business and the financial industry. And at the very heart of the implementation of the SDGs are civil societies. We have specific reference to civil societies. I mean, in different parts of the SDG, especially SDG 12, sustainable consumption and production. Everybody can do something to promote the SDG implementation. There are innovative research projects like the project Food for Work of Freie Universität Berlin and partners. And food is very critical to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to sustain livelihoods. The universities united in the Una Europa Alliance have many more research, teaching and green campus management projects related to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the 17 SDGs. We can say that the agenda has gained very strong traction at international, national and local level. Diverse stakeholders, not only universities, but international organizations, government agencies, cities, the business sector, the financial industry, civil society organizations and think tanks show their commitment in various forms. Sustainability concepts are discussed and further advanced by different academic disciplines. Thank you for listening and most welcome to stay in contact. Bye bye from Berlin.